This meeting today is entitled Why Class Matters, and I'm going to try to put forward, I think, why for Marxists it is such a central part of our theory. And to start with, and to say that we always say that we live in a class society. Now, this may not be a particularly, might be a fairly obvious thing at one level, that people know we live in a class society in the sense that they know there's rich and poor, they know there are people who are billionaires, they know that there are people who are much, much wealthier while other people are homeless or living on the streets or whatever the situation. And of course, there are massive differences in terms of different parts of the world. So I think at one level, if you like, empirically, that's all very obvious to people. But of course, the way in which this class society is portrayed is very much about the individual rather than seeing it as a kind of collective thing. So when you talk about what class you come from, this is very much identified as a question of culture or of identity. And it's very much portrayed that this is a society, we have a great deal of talk about things like meritocracy, that anybody can rise to the top if they work hard or if they study, if they get to university and get a good degree, then they can become anything that they want to become. And this is a very strong ideology of capitalism, that if you sort yourself out, if you overcome maybe many disadvantages that you have in society, you too can be a Tory politician, or you too can be a banker, or you too can be these sorts of things, and that's what you should aspire to. And this kind of sentiment is so strong that I know where I live in East London, the schools, which are now all academies, a number of them actually have the low, and are catering by and large for very poor, huge numbers of ethnic minority children, also have the logos of KPMG, various banks, because they sponsor these academies. And that whole ideology is very, very deeply within them. And of course, when you talk about culturally for working class people, I would argue that that's seen now. If you look at, for example, the theory of intersectionality, where there's all sorts of ways in which you can look at oppression, that class is seen as just one of those things. So you might be gay, you might be black, you may be a woman, and you may be working class. And these are all kind of just almost like a sort of series of discrete things, that separate things that sort of center people out. And particularly when people talk about the working class in this context, they do so in a totally cultural way. And they do so which almost suggests that everybody working class is extremely poor, probably on benefits, free school meals for their kids, living in terrible accommodation, and maybe criminal and all sorts of things as well. This is a very, very common assumption about class, and quite different actually even from the 60s and 70s when I was growing up, where working class people were seen in a much more, still you had the huge class society, but seen in a more favourable light. Now it's almost as though the working class is just an underclass and that everybody else are really sort of middle class. This is expressly put in the United States, where the working class has almost disappeared as a category to explain people, but it's also true in Britain. So I think the first thing for us to do when we talk about class society is to discuss it in different terms from this, and to discuss it in terms of that it's an objective relationship, that class isn't something that you kind of think, I'm middle class because I wear certain clothes, or because I go to the opera, or I'm working class because I have sauce bottles on the table, or whatever the kind of sociological definitions of this are. There's an objective relationship, and it's to do with whether or not you are exploited, whether or not you are forced to sell your labor power in order to exist. And that, it seems to me, that whole system of what's called exploitation, which is essentially the means by which we work, and a portion of the wealth that we produce is taken in the form of profit by the capitalist class, that's absolutely central to whether we are working class or not. And I just want to quote from what Marx and Engels write about this in The Holy Family, which is one of their earliest writings together. It was done in the late 1830s, which shows how very, very in the late 1840s, which shows how very advanced they were in terms of their understanding. And they say the difference between the working class, and we'll perhaps come on to this a bit later, and other classes is that the working class cannot emancipate itself without abolishing the conditions of its own life. In other words, this whole process of exploitation has to be abolished in order to succeed. And they say it's not a question of what this or that proletarian, proletarian is the phrase they use to mean the working class, or even the whole proletariat at the moment regards as its aim. So it doesn't matter what you think you're doing as a working class or what you actually are doing as a working class. It's a question of what the proletariat is and what, in accordance with this being, it will historically be compelled to do. And what they're saying there is that this objective relationship means whatever people's ideas about their own place in society, and whether or not, in terms of the early working class, they might have harked back to a life on the land, which their parents or grandparents had, actually their role as exploited workers would lead them to have to challenge the society in which they lived and have to try to overcome it. And they saw the working class, when they say that it has to abolish the conditions of its own existence in order to emancipate itself. That means, firstly, that it is a revolutionary class. It's a class which has to transform society in order to achieve a revolution, which is unlike previous classes. You know, the capitalist class, when it overthrew feudalism, was a minority within feudal society, but was able to achieve that through a number of different institutions and accumulation of wealth and so on. For the working class, this isn't possible. But also, it's not just a revolutionary class, it's also what they call a universal class. In other words, it's a class that speaks for the whole of the rest of the oppressed and exploited within society. And therefore, it has this role, which is absolutely fundamental, absolutely unique to the working class. And I just, again, would like to just quote from another Marxist, a guy called Hal Draper, who I put forward as some of the recommended reading, some of his writings on class, and I would recommend them to anybody. He's it's very detailed and what's sometimes called scholarly, which isn't always used in a good way, but he is incredibly scholarly and was a Marxist activist himself. And he says, experience shows that the whole of society quivers when the working class stirs. When a substantial sector of it undertakes a large-scale battle, the authorities react as to civil war. And this is true even on terrain far from revolution. So again, what he's saying there is, as soon as there's major strikes or major upheavals of any sort, this is the class which really begins to define what's happening in society and really begins to make people look at it in a different way. And certainly, I've been doing a lot of reading recently on the early 70s, which is when I first became politically active. And you know, the role of the working class then was, particularly in 50 years ago, 1972, was absolutely immense in this country in terms of very, very big, earth-shaking strikes. And it's certainly true. People then begin to define for or against in terms of what you stand for. And Draper goes on to say that unlike other classes, he says, however desperate a peasantry or a petty bourgeoisie lower middle class may become, these societies cannot give society a lead in a new direction. These classes cannot give society a lead in a new direction, not simply because of social or psychological constraints, but because there is no social solution that effectively corresponds to these classes' interests, while at the same time corresponding to the interests of society in general. So what he's saying there is, again, that, you know, this whole role of the working class, as if you like, in Marx's view, and in the view, I think, of most Marxists, trying to give, not to just say we're doing this on our own and we're going to ignore other classes, peasantry, a very big class in a number of countries, sections of the lower middle classes and small shopkeepers and businessmen and so on. But it's the working class that is capable of expressing demands which take the whole of society forward. And that's so very, very important to this question. So this first thing is about what the working class is rather than what it sees itself as necessarily. And I think to look at that now in the 21st century, there are so many kind of stereotypes of what class is, and I think of what the working class is. You know, the stereotype is still very much connected with sort of manual workers and men and people working in factories and so on. And of course, that's a situation which has very dramatically changed over the last half century or so in the developed world. And I think, therefore, we have to, well, we always should have thought of all sorts of other groups of people as part of the working class. And indeed, people did with, for example, clerical workers. But it's much more clear today that if you're looking at the working class, you have to have a very wide definition of what the working class is, including, far from it being with the question of intersectionality, that you've got women and you've got LGBT and you've got different races or different nationalities, and these are all separate situations. Actually, the vast majority of the oppressed are also part of the working class. And again, it's through working class struggle that you can talk about talking about the emancipation of the various oppressed groups in society. And therefore, I would very much identify the working class as the vast majority of women, of Black and ethnic minority people, of disabled, of people of different ages. These aren't people who are primarily divided by these characteristics. They're divided much more centrally by their class location and what they do in it. And that's why, you know, when we look at questions of, for example, women's oppression, I mean, someone raised the question of, could I deal with the question of whether women are a sex class and a separate class? And I would argue they're not. I would argue that they're fundamentally oppressed within capitalist society, within class society, but that actually they're part of a working class, which is also male, which is also people of different races, which is also all those different things. And actually they face a ruling class, which is mainly white, is obviously the male half of it is usually in a more powerful position than the women of those classes, but nonetheless, you find that the unity of those classes, both men and women, as we saw with people like Margaret Thatcher, is much greater than what divides them on grounds of sex. So I'll just put that in there, and perhaps we can return to that later in discussion. Now, I want then to move on to the question of working class consciousness, because I think it's obvious to all of us that if we are objectively working class, or if large numbers of people in Britain and elsewhere are objectively working class, if this is potentially a revolutionary class, at the same time, we're a very long way from this being the actuality of people's life. And why did Marx think that consciousness, that workers would adopt a revolutionary consciousness? He said that because of their conditions of life, because of this exploitation, this would lead to conflict with the employing class, with the ruling, not just the individual employers, but with the ruling class as a whole. And this, what he called class struggle, would lead to changed consciousness. Now, I think the first thing to say to that, and again, I guess this is pretty obvious to all of us, is that that's not an automatic process. It's not an automatic process for a number of reasons. It's not an automatic process because the working class is divided. I've talked about the different oppressions that exist, and we know that the creation and reinforcing and deepening of these oppressions has often been used by the ruling classes in order to continue these divisions within the working class and in order to weaken the working class as a whole. I mean, this was the case still, if you look at the history of religious sectarianism, not just in the north of Ireland, but in the west of Scotland and in parts of Lancashire and other parts of this country. Some of this sectarianism, at least, was the attempt to use Irish workers as blacklegs, as were called blackleg scabs, in industrial disputes. And it was one of these things that led to the divisions between the two. So there's nothing automatic, nothing necessarily that leads in the progressive direction about oppressed people feeling their oppression. They may react to it by looking at other groups of oppressed people and finding themselves in conflict with those people. So it can lead to division as well. And I think that's one of the questions about consciousness, but also because even when you do have class struggle, not everybody develops consciousness which sees the need for revolutionary politics. Far from it. Most people who go out and strike, most people who've been involved in for example, the UCU strikes in the universities before Christmas, they don't turn around and say, okay, I'm going to be a revolutionary socialist. A minority of them will do, because they begin to see the connection with their own dispute and what's happening in wider society. But many of them will just decide that, okay, the strike hasn't got anything. Can we get one with the next strike? Just carry on with their own lives. Maybe see voting for Keir Starmer as an answer to this. It might seem to us that's not a particularly strong response, but it's probably a response that lots of people feel. So it doesn't automatically lead to this. But it is an important part of getting people on the road to understanding the true nature of society. And this question of class struggle, when we look at the progress in society, then actually many of the things, probably most of the things that we take for granted now in capitalist society are things that have been fought for and struggled for very, very bitterly against sections, at least, of the ruling class. And, you know, Marx and Engels write in the Communist Manifesto when they say it's not just that the worker is exploited at work, you're also giving a proportion of your wages to the landlord. Well, everyone knows how much of that is costing people. You're also giving it to the supermarkets in terms of rising food prices. You're also suffering from the laws, like the laws that are going through Parliament at the moment to restrict protests and all sorts of other laws as well. So all of these, the fight against these and the changing of society as a result of a successful fight against these is how society progresses. But that's not anything that the ruling class or the employers will ever give you credit for. So Trotsky wrote about the English Revolution of the 17th century, where they cut off the king's head and abolished the House of Lords and had a republic. He says this is all completely hidden in British history now. It's all, and he describes all the changes in British society are what he says cloaked in gradual change. They try to make out that all of this was gradualism, that gradually people got the vote bit by bit. And then, you know, firstly it was skilled workers, then later on women got the vote, or some women got the vote, then others got the vote. That isn't the case at all. And actually, if you look at it, what is it that led to better attitudes towards questions of sexism, racism, gay liberation, all these different questions? Well, in our lifetimes, this has been the great movements of the 60s and the early 70s for civil rights in the United States, for women's liberation, against war, Stonewall, all these different things. You would not know this from identity politics. You know, identity politics, you know, equality, diversity, and inclusion is the watchword of so many sort of business and university and official kind of doctrines, you know, that we're all in favor of this equality, while the gender pay gap stays pretty much as it was, while there's massive discrimination against race in work, and all of these different kind of things goes on. They have to hide the radical and revolutionary elements which lead to these changes, because to do otherwise would be to admit that the struggles that led to those changes were actually struggles against the very class that is now trying to adopt sections of them for their own benefit, and of course to deny any more radical elements of the struggle, like the taking down of statues, or like all the things that are identified with Black Lives Matter and those kind of things. So very, very important that we see class struggle at the centre of how people think about class and develop about class, and of course in terms of changing our own ideas. There's a very famous quote from Marx and Engels in the German Ideology, where they say that the working class needs a revolution, not just to change society, not just to get rid of exploitation and private property and profit and all these things. It needs it for its own, to sort out its own head, if you like, collectively, to rid itself of the muck of ages and fit itself to build society anew. And actually in Draper's book, when I was looking at it, there's also a quote from a letter that Laura Marx, who was Marx's middle daughter, wrote to Engels. And she says, "The rottenness of our society breaks out. There is no denying it, as well among the workmen as among," she's talking about corrupt French politicians. "And a revolution is badly needed to sweep the world clean." And that's a very good little phrase, actually, for why we do need a revolution, to clean up not just the corruption and the rottenness, but all the different aspects of society which leads to the divisions inside the working class and all these other kind of questions. So it seems to me we have to look at that. Consciousness changing on a mass scale is so important. And of course, people change their ideas individually. We've all changed our ideas individually. Hopefully, some of us, by coming to meetings like this and to reading books and to watching films and all the things that suddenly make you see different aspects of society in a new way. And they're very, very important for us. But to change consciousness on a mass scale takes more than education, takes more than individual talking to people, important as all those things are, because suddenly when you're on a picket line, I mean, I was watching actually, the TUC have put out for once rather a good little video today about a guy in the street goes up to people and he's asking people, what do you think about this contract? And it's a fire and rehire contract. It says, sorry, you've lost your job, but we'll take you on for lower pay. And it's very, very interesting because people are just saying stuff like, is this a joke? And then they're saying, no, of course I wouldn't do that. Of course I wouldn't sign up to that. And people are saying things that are ruder than that as well. I mean, it's quite an interesting thing to look at. But you think about that, of course, people are there's many, many workers who have accepted those fire and rehire contracts. Why? Not because they want to, but because there's been some collective struggle over it, which has been successful, and some which has been less successful. But the crucial question here is you cannot resolve that kind of question individually, but as soon as you look at it in the collective way, that everybody at your work is being told they're having less wages and worse conditions and so on, that it's only by doing it in a collective way you begin to realize the possibility of change. You begin to realize how the police behave. You begin to realize how the authorities behave. You begin to realize, as the miners did during their strike, when they cut the benefits for the families of the miners, and you realize that's the state acting against all of you. People begin to look at it in those kind of ways. So very important that. Just final point I want to make is really about political representation. And we can come on to perhaps discussing this more, that working class people, for the most part, have what's called kind of contradictory consciousness, that there's aspects of the system that they accept and there's aspects of the system that they reject. And part of the job, I think, for revolutionary socialists is how to try to overcome that contradictory consciousness. Contradictory consciousness is what leads to the formation of organizations like the Labour Party, like socialist parties around the country, which on the one hand represent some of the interests of working people as against the openly ruling class parties in parliament and so on. On the other hand, accept the basic fundamentals of the nature of exploitation, the nature of imperialism, all these different sorts of aspects. So that is obviously a limit in terms of political representation. And one of the reasons that I think as a revolutionary socialist, you have to go beyond that is because what we're trying to do is to build an organization which is based on an understanding that there does have to be a fundamental change in society. And that has to be brought about by mass organization and struggle, and in the process, the changing of ideas. And in order to achieve that, we have to group together the people who best understand that and who are best involved in those struggles and who can learn some of the history of past struggles and who can learn the importance of organizing in that kind of way. And that is what revolutionary organization is all about. And it's very much in contradiction to the aims of Labour, which the aims of Labour are essentially to replace the Tory party as a party of government and to try to ameliorate the worst aspects of the system. And they do it increasingly badly as the system ages and gets into increasing problems. Our job is to say we want to ameliorate the system in terms of winning reforms, but ultimately this system can only be changed by a very, very fundamental change in society, and that involves a revolutionary transformation.